Hi, this is Matt Baker. Exactly 7 years ago on this date, we released one of our most popular videos ever. Who would be King of America if George Washington had been made a monarch? Now, obviously, the title wasn't meant to be taken seriously because the United States has never actually been interested in having a king, and in fact, to this day, is very much against it. But that's okay because the video was really just an excuse to delve into the family tree of George Washington and to learn a bit of history. Well, since it's been 7 years, and since I've recently learned several extra things about his tree, I thought it would be a good idea to do a sort of update or part 2, especially considering that on this particular 4th of July, the US is celebrating its 250th anniversary. So what better time to take a closer look at the country's main founder? Okay, so the first thing I need to remind you of is that George Washington did not have any biological children of his own, at least not that we know of, which is why figuring out who his heir would be today is very tricky. In my previous video, I suggested 3 different hypothetical scenarios, one based on the line of his older half-brother Augustine, one based on the line of his adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis, and one based on the line that inherited his Mount Vernon estate. Of these 3 lines, the one that a lot of people found the most surprising was the middle one, so let me refresh your memory about it. Around 30 years before he became president, George Washington married a wealthy widow named Martha, whose first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died 2 years previously. Martha had 4 children with her first husband, but only one of these survived to become an adult, a son named John Parke Custis. A year before the Revolutionary War broke out, John married Eleanor Calvert and fathered several children with her. But then, just 2 weeks after the surrender at Yorktown, he died, probably from typhus contracted at a military camp. At this point, his 2 youngest children, George and Nellie, were adopted by their grandmother, Martha, as well as their step-grandfather, George Washington, who went on to become the first U.S. president. Now, here's the interesting thing. G.W.P. Custis had only one child with his wife Mary, who lived to adulthood, a daughter named Mary, and that Mary went on to wed Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general. Thus, if George Washington had become king, and if he had named his adopted son as his heir, and if everything else had stayed the same, meaning same marriages and same births, which is actually really unlikely, but if all of these things were true, it would be the descendants of Robert E. Lee who would wear the crown today. Take note that at the time of my first video, Robert E. Lee IV was still living, but has since passed away, meaning that the heir of George Washington through this line is now his son, Robert E. Lee V. This time, I've opted not to share his photo or any information about him, and I've done likewise for all the other living people on this tree because, after all, they deserve their privacy. So don't go trying to contact any of these people to tell them to claim their throne. Now, going back to G.W.P. Custis, one extra thing that I recently learned about him was that in real life, he likely had a pretty close connection to real royalty. You see, the father of Eleanor Calvert was Benedict Calvert, who might have been an illegitimate grandchild of King George I. Now, while the Washington family itself, as well as most Americans, are descended from royalty, if you go back far enough, very few descend from a king as recent as George I. So, in other words, George Washington Parke Custis may have been in real life a tiny bit royal. However, as I mentioned in the previous video, if George Washington had been made king, I think it would have been very unlikely that his adopted son would have been named his heir. That's because in real life, George Washington left a very detailed will, and in it he basically revealed who he trusted the most. Although he left many relatives bequests, the bulk of his estate, including his main property at Mount Vernon, as well as all of his personal papers, went to just one person, his nephew, Bushrod Washington, who, I might add, also happened to be a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Now, Bushrod, which I mistakenly pronounced Bushrod last time, to the amusement of many, is a rare name, so let me take a moment to explain where it comes from. In this case, it was the maiden name of Bushrod's mother. In Old English, a rod means a clearing, so basically, Bushrod has the same meaning as bushfield, which, by the way, was the name of the Bushrod plantation. Now, last time I said that Bushrod Washington didn't have any children. I'm going to come back to this later, but for now, take note that what I should have said was that he didn't have any official, meaning white, children. This is why, after his death, the Mount Vernon estate went to his nephew, John A. Washington II, and then on to John A. Washington III, who was the final member of the family to own the property. You see, although in some alternative timeline, John A. Washington III might have been King John, and Mount Vernon may have been turned into a palace, in real life, what happened was that in 1858, John A. Washington III sold the president's former residence to a charity called the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association, and this charity has operated it as a historical site ever since. However, if that hadn't happened, and if this line had been the monarchs of the USA, there would have been 3 more King Johns, and then finally a Queen Mary. Now, again, at the time of the original video, Mary Schaffner was still living. However, she has since passed away, meaning that the heir of George Washington through this line is now her son, Larry. Now, one other real-life thing to note about John A. Washington III is that he fought in the Civil War on the side of the South. In fact, all of the close relatives of George Washington, 12 in total, fought for the Confederacy, which is something that a lot of people find quite surprising. But really, it shouldn't be, nor should be the connection to Robert E. Lee, because after all, the Washingtons were from Virginia, and virtually all of them, George Washington included, were enslavers. Which brings me back to Bushrod Washington. In 1802, after the death of First Lady Martha Washington, Bushrod officially inherited and moved into Mount Vernon. With him came around 80 enslaved individuals, one of whom was a mixed-race man named West Ford. In 1805, Bushrod gave West Ford his freedom and appointed him manager of Mount Vernon, a post which he held until it was taken over by the Ladies Association. Now, the only thing we know for sure about West Ford's parentage was that his mother was a woman named Venus, who was enslaved by John A. Washington, the father of Bushrod. However, it has been claimed that the father of West Ford was none other than George Washington. But it's important to note that most historians disagree with this for several reasons. First, it is widely believed that the first president was in fact sterile, meaning that he was unable to produce any children, the health reasons for which continue to be debated. Second, Venus was enslaved at Bushfield, which was owned by George's brother John, not at Mount Vernon. So it's much more likely that West Ford was fathered by either John or by one of his sons. Third, because Bushrod in particular gave West Ford such special treatment, and because the two men looked quite a bit alike, there's a fairly good argument to be made that it was Bushrod who was the father of West Ford. Now, either way, take note that what we're dealing with here is even if violence was not involved, because in cases where the man is an enslaver and the woman is an enslaved person, there can be no such thing as consent, which, although horrible, needs to be recognized as being a part of U.S. history, just like slavery itself. In fact, the practice was so common that most African American descendants of slavery today have about 20 to 25% European DNA. The other thing we can be almost certain of is that whether it was George Washington or Bushrod Washington or some other Washington, the father of West Ford was in fact a male line Washington, which means that his descendants definitely belong on this tree. The most famous descendant of West Ford was his grandson, George William Ford, who was one of America's very first Buffalo Soldiers, meaning that he belonged to an all-black military unit. George went on to manage several national cemeteries and served as a major in the Spanish-American War. Moving forward to today, here's a photo of some West Ford descendants. that got together for a reunion just last year. So maybe in some alternative timeline in which King Bushrod ended slavery and made West Ford his heir, the king or queen of America today would be one of these people. But we're not done yet because there are several more branches of the tree to look at. But before we do that, I want to point out that if you're interested in U.S. history, you'll definitely want to check out our new Timeline of U.S. History, which is available as a poster from our website, usefulcharts.com. It shows how and when each state was formed, as well as providing lots of other important information, such as key events, and which party held the House, Senate, and presidency at any given time. We also have a timeline for European history and world history, as well as lots of family trees covering Roman emperors, European monarchs, and Asian monarchs. Again, if you're interested in learning more about any of these posters, just head over to usefulcharts.com or simply click the link in the description or pinned comment. Okay, let's now return to the family tree of George Washington. Notice that on this new version of the tree, I've shown 6 different branches instead of just 3. I chose to do this in order to highlight the fact that in his last will and testament, the first president named 6 executors, 1 for each major branch of his family. The 6 were William Washington, representing his half-brother Augustine's line, his wife Martha, representing the Parke Custis line, Lawrence Lewis, representing his sister Betty's line, George Steptoe Washington, representing his brother Samuel's line, Bushrod Washington, representing John's line, and finally Samuel Thornton Washington, representing his brother Charles' line. Now, of these 6 executors, 2 ended up being the main ones, Bushrod and Lawrence Lewis, who, I should point out, ended up marrying Nellie Parke Custis. So not only was Lewis the nephew of George Washington, he was also his son-in-law, albeit through adoption. On top of this, after George Washington's presidency, Lewis became Washington's personal secretary, which resulted in the 2 men becoming quite close. Because of these reasons, Lewis felt almost certain that it was he who was going to inherit Mount Vernon. But of course, as we already know, he didn't. It went to Bushrod instead, which led to a great deal of resentment on the part of Lewis. However, according to Martha, George Washington had 2 versions of his will, and near the end of his life, he instructed her to throw one into the fire and to use the other one. So maybe in that other will, Lawrence Lewis did inherit Mount Vernon. If that will had been the one saved, and if George Washington had been king, what then? Well, according to my research, the senior-most descendant in this line would be a certain Charles Conrad Lewis III. Okay, I now want to return to the Parke Custis line for a moment, because G.W.P. Custis actually had at least one other daughter, named Maria, whom he eventually acknowledged as his own. You see, Maria's mother was a woman named Ariana Carter, who had been born enslaved, held in bondage by Martha Washington. Later, both Ariana and her daughter Maria continued to be enslaved by G.W.P. Custis, who by that time had inherited the land, which is today the Arlington National Cemetery, where he ordered the construction of Arlington House. Now, interestingly, only 2 couples have ever been married at Arlington House. The first was Maria Carter and her husband, Charles Cifax, who were both enslaved at the time, although a few years later, Maria and her children were given their freedom, as well as 17 acres of land at Arlington. The only other couple to be married at Arlington House was Maria's half-sister Mary and Robert E. Lee. They ended up inheriting the place, but lost it during the Civil War when it was taken over by the Union. Today, Arlington House is known as the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Charles and Maria had 10 children, including William, who, after the war, became president of the Board of Trustees for colored schools in Washington, and John, who served as one of the first Black members of the Virginia House of Delegates. By the 20th century, the Cifax family had grown to become one of the most prominent Black families in the country, made up of professors, doctors, civil rights activists, business leaders, veterans, and at least one congressman. So, interestingly, of all the branches of the Washington family, It is this one that became the most aristocratic, even though they've obviously never held any noble titles. Okay, I now want to look at the Samuel line, because since Samuel was the eldest full brother of George Washington, it is the current descendants of Samuel who are often said to be the closest living relatives of the first president. So I've already pointed out George Steptoe, who was one of the 6 executors of George Washington's will. Well, he had 2 sons, who were recently the subjects of a scientific study that helped determine the first president's exact Y-chromosomal haplotype. You see, DNA was collected from their remains, as well as from one of John's current male line descendants, named Samuel Walter Washington. And through the study, published in 2024, it was determined that George Washington's Y-chromosomal haplogroup is RU152. So basically, if you get the same result on a DNA test, it means that both you and George Washington have a male line ancestor in common who lived around 2500 BCE in Europe. Take note that George Steptoe's male-only line eventually died out. So these days, the closest living relative of the first president is considered to be the most senior male descendant of this person here. In 1976, an NBC News program determined this to be Paul Washington. However, Paul passed away in 2014, so the distinction is now held by his son Richard. Okay, so the only 2 lines that I haven't yet talked about in this video are the Charles line and the Augustine line. I wasn't able to find anything new or interesting about either of those, but if you know anything, do share it with us in the comments. I will point out that the senior-most person in the Augustine line, Bryn Kelly, is still living, so there's been no change there. Okay, so for the remainder of the video, I thought I'd mention how a few other famous people connect to the tree. The first is Denzel Washington, probably the most famous person today with the last name Washington. Now, while I haven't been able to confirm this through solid genealogical research, there are several amateur trees out there, including one on the Useful Charts subreddit, which claim that Denzel's great-great-grandfather was the son of Bushrod Washington and a woman he enslaved named Louisa. Again, I haven't been able to find any primary records to back this up, so if anyone does know more about this, do let us know in the comments. However, I will say that because George Washington was so famous, after emancipation, a lot of former enslaved people chose to take the name Washington as a surname, regardless of whether or not they had actually been held in bondage by the Washington family. This practice was so common that today around 90% of people with the last name Washington are Black Americans, with no close biological connection to the first president. As for other U.S. presidents that George Washington is related to, the closest would be the 4th president, John Madison, although it's not by blood. You see, George Steptoe Washington, who I mentioned earlier, married Lucy Payne, and Lucy Payne was the sister of Dolly Payne, better known as First Lady Dolly Madison. The closest blood relative, who also became president, would be William Harrison. Earlier, I did a video about how 20 U.S. presidents are related, and in that video, I showed how the 2 Harrisons descend from Anne Washington, who was the sister of Lawrence Washington, the great-great-grandfather of George Washington. So that makes the 1st president and the 9th president 4th cousins twice removed. There is, however, another famous U.S. general that is fairly closely related to George Washington, and that is George Patton. You see, George Washington had an aunt named Mildred Washington, and if we go 7 generations down from her, we come to the famous World War II leader. Now, some conspiracy theorists claim that a certain other famous president is actually the son of George Patton, due to the fact that the 2 men look somewhat alike. But I'm not going to go there because trying to find out who would be king of America if George Washington had been made king is already a really big stretch. Okay, so that was another look at the family tree of the first president. Again, if you're interested in U.S. history or just history in general, do check out the posters that we sell over at usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.